Howdy, folks. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, I have a Bjorn's Mighty Thoughts video. Going to be taking the time to talk about some news I've seen recently related to the Russian-Ukrainian war, and that's got to do with NATO tanks getting supplied to the Ukrainians. And I do have quite a few thoughts about this, and it seems to be thoughts that's being missed a lot by the media outlet as well as some YouTubers of why, personally, I think this is a bad idea, and I'm going to dive into it a little bit here. But so right now, as it stands, Poland apparently wants to send Leopard 2A fours to Ukraine, as well as the United States has stated that they're going to send 31 M1 Abrams tanks. They haven't quite indicated the model. I haven't been able to find out if they're M1A1s, M1A2s, M1A2Cs, nothing along those lines. For all I know, they could be M1IPs. But nothing's really been indicated there in great detail, just that we're sending 31 tanks to Ukraine, as well as apparently the British wants to supply the Ukrainians with some old Challenger 2s, which, oof, I'm not 100% sure about that one because of different logistical reasons. But let me give my background here so that way we have a bit of a pedigree. I am not some world renowned tank expert. I am not Nicholas Moran. I am not David Fletcher. However, I am the Mighty Bjorn, and I do actually have time in the service as a tanker. So this is a field of expertise per se, quote unquote. I do know because I did serve in the United States Army, as well as I read a lot of history books. So there you go. There's my expertise, my pedigree, if you will. Now let's start diving into a bit of history about different times that tanks have been used as military aid throughout the years. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm trying to set a precedence here of flaws with sending tanks as military aid. Let's start off here with the World War II Lend-Lease Act. And it worked in various degrees, particularly with the British, because in the beginning, we were supplying the British with M3 Grants and M3 Stuart tanks, as well as M5 Stuarts. And we also did supply them with Shermans as well. And the Shermans worked out well for them. But I understand by that point, they've already had the painstaking process of dealing with the M3 Grant and the M3 Lee. And that's actually where the real problem was, is the British needed tanks in Africa. We sent them tanks, and we sent them M3 Lees and M3 Grants, mostly M3 Grants, which was a little different than the M3 Lee. But they really didn't, while they did have some training because we did send some advisors on using these tanks, they didn't really have a good idea of how to use them. They were kind of rushed on their training, and they kind of rushed the tanks into combat. And it would end up coming back and biting the British a couple times in combat against the German tank crews. And there's a whole thing about that, which obviously just open up a history book and read about Africa and the different things that they dealt with there. So, yes, at the end of the day, especially towards the end of the war, as time progressed, it did work out for them because the M4s actually worked out pretty good for the British, especially because they had the Firefly, which was a hole puncher. But there were still issues there, especially in the realm of logistics and things of that nature, at least up until America got involved in the war. And then that kind of shifted things around quite a bit because essentially a lot of the spare parts and stuff that they would need for these tanks was in country in Europe during World War II because the United States was there as well. So there was plenty of parts to go around. Now, the next war I want to talk about here is the Vietnam War. Now, this one only vaguely worked out. The United States supplied ARVN troops with M48 Pattons. Understand that they were older M48 Pattons. They were like M48A1s, but there was some A3s there, which that was like the M48 at the time. There was the United States was replacing their M48s with M60s, the M60 Patton, which is one reason why we were able to provide them with these old M48s. We also supplied them with M41 Walker Bulldogs. Now, here's kind of the issue, though, with Vietnam, is Vietnam really, the terrain is just really horrible for tanks. So the tanks only sort of worked out for the South Vietnamese. And honestly, even for the Americans, the tanks didn't really work out exceptionally well either, just because the terrain is bad. The infrastructure is horrible for tanks, things of that nature. So, but from what I know, history wise, the ARVN troops, when they would encounter NVA tank, when you have tank on tank battles, which there wasn't many in Vietnam, ARVN troops actually did do fairly well. So, not all bad there, but understand too, we had United States troops there. They had time to actually get trained on these tanks, on how to use and maintain them. They got time to learn the tactics. And that's kind of the thing here, is they got a lot of time before they actually had to, put the rubber to the road, if you will. Now, the next war I want to talk about, that the United States in particular provided aid, and actually the British provided aid as well, was to Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Now, here's the thing about the Yom Kippur War. The Israelis already had M48s. They already had M60s. They already had Centurion tanks. These were tanks that they were getting from various NATO countries as aid during the Yom Kippur War. But they already had these tanks in service, so they were just getting more of them. Now, with that being said, they also had the logistical support. They had the training because they were already had been used in these types of tanks for several years in small numbers. They were just getting more of them. So realistically, at the end of the day, this was not a big detriment to the Israeli military. And with that being said, it worked out for them for the most part at the end of the day, because they probably would have done worse during the Yom Kippur War than they did. So we actually probably did do them a favor. So 3 various degrees of how Lend-Lease and tanks' military aid has worked out over the years. So now I want to dive on into Ukraine here. As, like I said, the United States is planning to send 31, which I believe they've actually already shipped them, 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine doesn't really have any training on these tanks. They don't have the logistical support for these tanks because they don't have any. The ammunition that the Abrams tanks uses is completely different than the current Ukrainian tanks. The engine parts is different. The maintenance is different. The tactics is different. Everything is different on these vehicles. Essentially, these tanks, compared to what they're using now, is completely alien to them. One thing, too, that comes to mind is the training. They really aren't going to have time to train. The training for me when I enlisted in 2003 was 9 weeks of basic, which we can skip out on that because it's just basic. But my AIT, my advanced individual training, was 9 weeks also. So 9 weeks of training to essentially learn to become a tanker. Now, before I went to basic, I already had some training on the Abrams tanks, basically familiarity training. And they're not going to have that here. Now, I can argue that because they're already trained on tanks, that some of the stuff might be a little bit more expedient than it would be. However, with that being said, they're still going to have to take troops off the front line for several weeks to do training. And what's going to hurt more is actually not the tanker training, the mechanic training. Teaching the mechanics how to maintain the Abrams tanks. The next problem, too, is going to be the bridges and the infrastructure. Essentially, the Ukrainians, from what I understand, most of their bridges are not rated to have a 60-ton, 70-ton tank sitting on it. Their military bridges, from what I understand, like the bridge you see here, are only rated for roughly 50 tons, which is perfect for a T-72. But it can't even hold an empty Abrams tank, to be honest. I mean, Abrams tanks are over 60 tons. So that's going to be a problem for them in itself. A lot of their civilian bridges is also going to be a problem as well, because a lot of the civilian bridges are not rated to maintain that kind of weight, the 60-ton weight limit that an Abrams tank is, and let alone we're looking at Abrams tanks. Even if we look at the Leopard 2s, the Leopard 2s are also near 60 tons. I believe, if memory serves, they are 58 tons. So they're a little lighter than an Abrams, but not enough to make a difference. Once again, they don't have the military infrastructure for these kind of tanks. The next thing that becomes a problem is the logistics. Absolute logistics nightmare. Now imagine, if you will, let's just talk about their tanks. We're not going to talk about any other equipment. Right now, from what I understand, they have, if I understand information correctly, what they have in the realm of tanks is currently they have the Scorpion light tank, which is armed with a 76 millimeter gun. As well, it's a light tank. It's completely alien compared to a main battle tank in those regards. If they get Leopard 2s, that will have Leopard 2 A4s. If they get Abrams tanks, which, like I said, it's been confirmed they're getting Abrams tanks, they will have M1 Abrams tanks there. If they get Challenger 2s, they will have Challenger 2s. Okay, right there, that's 4 tanks. Okay, and then they have T-72s, T-64s, T-80s. Now, at least with the T-72s, the T-64s, and the T-80s, they're all fairly similar. They all can use the same fuel. A lot of them actually do share certain parts with one another. Not all parts are shareable across the board, understand. They're all autoloader based tanks, which that's going to be kind of a thing in itself, especially when you look at stuff like the Challenger 2, the Abrams, the Leopard 2. All those tanks need loaders, which means less crewmen for the tanks. Basically, you need more people per tank. And basically basically it comes down to, for every 3 tanks, you're going to have one less tank than you normally would with an autoloader. I'd probably explain that pretty poorly. And that's kind of the issue, is like none of our stuff works with the Soviet stuff, and none of the old Soviet stuff works with our stuff. So that's going to make a logistic nightmare, because now you got different types of logistics going all over the place. And if, say, Soviet tank ammo, or Eastern Bloc ammo, if you will, is sent to a tank company that's equipped with NATO tanks, and they need ammo now, they're fucked. Just saying. Now, the next thing, too, is the ramifications. I did see a speech, this was several months ago now at this point, that essentially Putin was going off about a whole new world order thing. I know it sounded like tinfoil hat stuff, did at the time. And here's the thing, if NATO is sending all these tanks, equipment, and we start sending advisors, because we're going to have to send advisors now, he's going to be able to point at Ukraine and go, see, we were trying to liberate a portion of Ukraine, and NATO's coming here to conquer Russia. You're next. Don't you think that's a conversation he could have with China? No one's thinking about the nuclear ramifications. No one's thinking about what if he decides to mobilize all of the Russian military. Because understand, he's only mobilizing a part of it right now. So I think the ramifications are not being considered here in full. For some odd reason, people thinks he's suddenly a blowhard, even though he has a track record of doing everything he says he's going to do. So if he says he's going to use nukes, I definitely would not tread lightly on that. So I think the question that really needs to be asked at the end of the day is are these tanks going to make a difference? Realistically, I think it's going to add more of a burden to the Ukrainian military than they've already got to deal with being over there under constant combat conditions. Like I said, training, logistics, bridges, the whole 9 yards. It's all going to be a burden that their military is going to have to deal with that their military currently doesn't have to deal with. And that being said, everybody wants to sit there and act like, hey, you know what? Abrams tanks, yeah, these are going to be solid tanks. We don't know what Abrams tanks they are yet. If they're M1A1s from the 90s, they're not going to make much of a difference in the way of protection. Yeah, the gunnery systems are going to be better than what Ukraine currently has on most of its tanks. However, that being said, most tanks out there nowadays has better gunnery systems than the Ukrainian tanks have. Not all of the Ukrainian tanks, but understand that not every tank is an Opelot BM either. Or what's the other one? And there's, I think it's T64 BVM or something like that. I can't remember what their most modern T64 is. And that being said, right now up front, we know that the United States is sending 31 tanks. I'm sorry, but that's not enough tanks to make a difference. When it comes to the Leopard, if they send Leopard 4A2s, from what I understand, these are old Leopard 4A2s that were produced in like the 80s, early 90s. So they're just, the armor protection is not the same as what it is on a current Leopard tank. It's not going to make a difference. And that's going to be the same way with the Challenger 2s. And they're going to find out really quick, too, that the Challenger 2s have a big, weak hull, at least if I understand things correctly. So while I think it's a bad idea to send them tanks, or at least those tanks, I think there's actually a better option for them. And actually, I think there's two better options for them. One in particular is the PT-91 from Poland. Poland is so dead set on sending Ukraine tanks. Now they're talking about sending Leopard 2A4s. Why doesn't Poland just send them PT-91s? I mean, Poland already has sent them some PT-91 tanks. The PT-91 is very close to what the Ukrainians are already using. Now, these are a bit more modern in the sense that they have thermal optics. They also have improved survivability. They have improved gunnery controls, and etc. And the fact is instead of 31 tanks, we can send them, well, Poland can send them over 200 tanks. Now, that would make a difference. It wouldn't stress their logistics. It wouldn't stress fuel or their infrastructure or anything else. So I don't understand why not the PT-91 or another good one that could be sent to the Ukrainians if we want to send them a smaller number. So what about the T-72 M4 CZ from the Czech Republic? Once again, you got a T-72. It's got improved survivability with its much upgraded ERA package. It's got improved automotives, improved gunnery controls, thermal optics for the gunnery system, as well as a tank commander independent thermal gunnery sight. So, like, these are two tanks that would take very little to no training for the Ukrainians to use. And now, from what I understand with the T-72 M4 CZ, there's only about 30 of them. So, not really too many. But these are two tanks that could be getting sent to Ukraine and could actually be beneficial to Ukraine. I would argue much more beneficial. I don't understand why it seems to be suddenly NATO tanks or nothing, because these would probably do them better than anything else that NATO is currently willing to send them. I don't get it. I really don't get it. Anyway, folks, I'm going to wrap the video up at that. What I'm going to say is send in them tanks, Challenger 2s, Leopard 2s, Abrams. It's the dumbest fucking idea I've ever heard for multiple reasons. And there's no huge benefit that they're going to actually get from such a limited number of tanks. But anyway, folks, thank you very much for tuning in. Hopefully you all enjoyed the video and have yourself a wonderful day. And hey, please take a moment, share this video, and like it if you enjoyed it.